Hello, everybody. This is the Wizard's Box. This is another Monday where we're going to be answering your questions on anything and everything surrounding the low oxalate diet. And as every Monday, I am joined by my beautiful co-wizards, Monique from Toronto, and Karla, that's joining us from Colorado. I'm Patricia de la Garza, and I'm joining you from Brussels, and you are most welcome. And we have a question to just get started about endogenous oxalate. So what I suggest is, how about if Monique just gives us a tiny little intro of what the difference is between dietary oxalate and what would be endogenous oxalate. What does endogenous means, I guess. And then Karla can back it up, with some things. And I will go looking at for some questions. Okay.
Perfect. Okay. So generally speaking, endogenous oxalate is the oxalate that your body makes, as opposed to dietary oxalate, which is the oxalate that you're consuming with your food. Now, I do want to set the stage here and say that everybody produces some endogenous oxalate as the normal function of their body. We're not worried about the small amount that you might make in that way, because our bodies know what to do with it. That oxalate will be excreted out of the body, and it's a small amount, so the kidneys are more than capable of handling that. And we actually excrete oxalate in multiple ways. So we can handle this little bit of endogenous oxalate. My understanding is that it's somewhere between maybe 15 and 30 milligrams of oxalate that you might be making endogenously. And so it's not a lot. However, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
So the challenge, though, is that for some of us, we might be consuming huge amounts of oxalate. So we might be getting a lot of dietary oxalate. And that's not really hard to do in today's world. We could be getting thousands of milligrams of it daily, especially if we're eating a paleo style diet. We've got mostly, the leafy greens that are the heavy hitters, like Swiss chard and spinach and beet greens, or we're eating a lot of these really high oxalate nuts or gluten-free alternatives. All of a sudden you can have this really high dietary intake. However, there are some of us who will have started to produce more oxalate out of the metabolism as well. And this is generally by my understanding, something that's going to happen when the body is under a lot of stress. We may have a lot of oxidative stress going on, and your body is attempting to respond to that by producing glutathione. And if at that same time, while you're trying to produce this glutathione, you actually have developed a deficiency of B6 because of your body's need for B6 as part of the process of making glutathione, that combination, deficient, at least in that situation, not enough B6, high oxidative stress, then in one of life's great ironies, this very pathway that's supposed to help you when you're in oxidative stress also starts to be a source of oxalate in the body. When you've got this endogenous production going on, some people think, well, that's the more important thing, so I don't have to worry about my diet. It's definitely more important for you to figure out and deal with that endogenous production with supplements and other, supports to the body so that you start to bring this endogenous oxalate down. But don't be deceived that all of a sudden you can ignore your dietary oxalate. So endogenous oxalate is the fire, and dietary oxalate is just throwing more fuel on it. So we really, we need to understand both these aspects. And but be aware that endogenous oxalate is not necessarily just going to respond to reducing oxalate in your diet. This is where what you need to do has to begin to involve things like supplements so that you can really start to address the deficiency of B6 and be able to help your body to stop producing this oxalate out of your own metabolism. Who wants to add to this?
I will. The other thing to consider is it's not just B6. B1 is also another deficiency that can put you on the path for endogenous production. And I'll just back up what Monique said about the diet. The diet is in some ways secondary, but like she said, you don't want to throw the diet out the window, because really all you're going to be doing is adding fuel to the fire. I just saw a question here with are there better forms of B6 or B1 to take? From personal experience, my son became an endogenous producer after we had switched from regular B6 to P5P, and he wasn't getting the right form of B1, which was for him benfotiamine. And he was, our doctor had recommended actually going to P5P, since you could take a smaller amount and still get as much bang for your buck, which was great in some ways, but from an oxalate perspective, it was disastrous, because he was taking a good amount of B6, but all his tests were showing a consistent B6 deficiency. As soon as we added the regular B6 back in, he went into a huge dump, but it started getting that back under control. So it's going to be kind of trial and error, because what the form that worked for my son, may not work for you or your kids. So for B1, it could be, allithiamine, it could be regular B1, it could be benfotiamine, which, was the case, for my kid. And for B6, it could be, regular 6 or P5P. You're just going to have to, to play around with it and figure out what works for you. It's pretty individual.
And it can actually be a combination of the both. Like in my case, if I took ordinary B6, like the paroxetine, it was a meh. If I took P5P, it was kind of a meh. But if I took both of them together, my system was very happy. And, the challenge is that there's research which shows that too much paroxetine could end up with B6 toxicity. So you want to approach it slowly, start with small doses, make sure somebody's monitoring your blood tests so that you're not putting yourself in a bad position while you're trying to address the issues that are going on.
Yes.
Which takes me to that point that we wanted to make at the beginning. Of course, we forgot, which is our disclaimer. This does not constitute medical advice. We're sharing our experiences. We're sharing what's worked for us and our families. We've been at this for a long, long time, and we're more than willing to share that experience with you. That doesn't mean we are the absolute oracle for everybody. We don't know you. We don't know your specificity. So just take everything that you hear and take it with a grain of salt, and make sure you are followed by a medical professional. And on that note, I think we can just, like to start from way back when, from the beginning. If somebody is just joining us, has never heard of what oxalate is and doesn't know what's going on and what are we talking about and whatever, oxalate is a toxin. It's literally a toxin. It's present in green leafy vegetables or leaves or whatever. And it's the way the plant keeps calcium stores. That's just the way the plant uses it. It also uses it to protect from bugs eating it, because the crystals are very sharp. When we eat oxalates, normally we have gut microbiome, we have gut bugs that are specialized in eating this toxin and rendering it harmless and letting it go out through normally our poop, or if it's being filtered through the kidneys, then through your urine. There is also, so that's the very large picture of what could be finding oxalates from our food. Now, there is this other part that Monique was talking, so that the food one is what we would call exogenous, from outside of us. It's oxalate that is not being built inside of us. And so that would be what we would be eating. And we have been seeing more and more with the new fades of green smoothies and lots of raw vegetarians and things like that, that people tend to tip off those levels that our gut bugs can handle. So they're eating a lot more, that's staying there. Our body doesn't know what to do with it, and it causes all sorts of problems. Now, endogenous oxalate, back at the beginning, that is endo, that means inside, and that is a byproduct of a metabolic cycle. And normally, if you see in a very, very simple way a metabolic cycle, think of it like like a wheel in one of those water molen. I'm thinking in Dutch now.
Mill. It's a mill.
Thank you. Like a water mill. So you think of it, and then it's just turning around when the input comes that makes the whole thing go around and around and around. That's a little bit how the chemistry of our metabolism works. And we have tons of different cycles working together in a perfect harmony to make work city Patricia. And we have all these different cycles moving around and working like little pieces of a clock. And what happens is that when you see, for example, the urine test that we recommend many times, which is the OAT, it measures the different metabolites of the different steps that are on that wheel. And what happens is that if we see that some of them are very high, there's a very good possibility that the wheel stopped and that stuff is accumulating in a certain part because something is missing to allow it to go all around and continue to circulate. I mean, this is a very, very simple explanation of what is happening, but I think it's helpful. So when you have some things that are low, it could be that further down the wheel, it's not getting there because the wheel is stuck or is slowed down. So you have a lot of this and not enough of that. Then you have a very good chance that right there in the middle, something's missing. And it could be one of the vitamins that provide, like the raw materials for an enzyme that is going to be used at that place on the wheel, or it could be something that is not being excreted correctly and it's just getting accumulated and it's making the whole thing stuck. So it's just part of the metabolism. And one of the things that we see, just like Monique and Karla said, is that when we're missing because we're using it for other things, something like B6, something like B1, then you don't have enough to produce the right amount of enzymes to make this wheel continue to turn. And what happens is that then that becomes your limiting factor. So let's say you're baking a cake and you have a bunch of ingredients in your pantry, but you only have half a cup of butter in your fridge. You can have 20 pounds of flour in your pantry. You will not make more cake than what you can use with your cups of butter. So that becomes the limiting factor. And that's what's happening. So if you have a shortage of B6, a shortage of B1, and a shortage of B9 or whatever, that would make those enzymes, then that becomes the limiting factor. And you can only make up to the amount that you have. Now, in order to understand why we always say do it low and slow, it's because if you have a wheel mill, and it's turning around and all of a sudden it's stuck and you have this huge volume of water accumulating, and all of a sudden you take away everything that's blocking it, what's going to happen? You're going to have a flood. It's going to go brah, and it's not going to be good. You're going to have erosion. You can have all sorts of problems. So what should happen is that you start lifting that blockage a little by little, allowing more and more of the volume to leave so that it starts turning normally again. So in that sense, if you're looking at this image, that's going to be a very good explanation or a very good image for you to keep before falling on the temptation that, oh my gosh, I'm feeling so good with a little bit of B6. Let me have the whole dose tomorrow and then see what happens. So you do not want to flood your system using this imagery. And this whole thing of metabolism and order is really important to keep in mind, to make sure that even though we want to dump, we want to get rid of all this toxin that has been accumulating in our body, we do not want to flood our system with it. I'm hoping that was clear.
Well, and I would just add, because you've done this great job with this analogy. And so what we're really saying is every good thing you take at the front end, you have to be able to handle at the back end as well. And so we don't know how many steps there are between the nutrient you take and its final disposition, so to speak. And some of those may be compromised. And that's exactly what Patricia was talking about with this whole, mill wheel analogy. So if you overload yourself with nutrients at one end, you have to be recognizing that your body's doing a lot of work. Some of it you may not be aware of, and your system has to be able to handle all those steps in the process right through to being able to potentially detox byproducts and get them out of your system.
I will give a good personal example with my son. We initially learned that he was an endogenous producer due to a B1 deficiency because we had switched B complex to a new brand because the brand that we were using was out of stock. And so we switched him to this brand that had a fairly small amount of benfotiamine, and he immediately, within a couple of hours of taking it, started dumping and actually started getting a rash that we hadn't seen before. It was a little red, a little ugly, and a little itchy, which was, not his typical dumping rash. I had a consult with Susan where she had looked at his oats from a number of years, and she had said it looks like he's probably an endogenous producer with a B6 deficiency. So I put him back on the B6, the amount of B6 that he had taken before we had switched from the regular form to P5P. Huge mistake. The kid had a rash pretty much on one side of his face, all down his back, down his legs. It was red. It was like hives. It was nasty. There was not enough magnesium and Epsom salt baths that I could give that kid for a couple of days to get him back to normal. You know, I had no idea that it would, that it would cause that. And if I had to do it all over again, I obviously would not have went with, that dose. I would have went a lot smaller and saved my kid a lot of pain and, a lot of discomfort.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you, when in doubt, always start slow.
Yes, I think a good rule of thumb, if you're going to start looking at supporting yourself with minerals or vitamins and things like that, different types of nutrients. To me, my go-to is I start with a fifth of the dose and then I add it slowly as I see it's coming. But it usually takes me at least 2 weeks, if not 3, to get to the target dose. And I think that has worked well here. That has saved us, I think, a lot of misery, because at the beginning we did not know this and we were just going gung-ho with the whole thing that we needed. And when we started seeing this whole idea of the metabolic cycles and how things are moving along and how we just need to just make sure that we keep that balance as gentle as possible. I think that is it's a good idea all the time. Now, one of the questions that comes often is, how do you know if you're an endogenous producer versus just eating oxalate? And that question comes from a lot of the people that have felt a lot better going carnivore. So they're saying, well, my diet is not very high at all in oxalate, but how do I know if this is still an issue? And the other question would be, how long do we have to keep at it, or is it something that we just need to do forever? Anybody wants to tackle that?
Well, this sort of leads in, one of the questions we got here is, can we do this? Can we handle this with foods instead of supplements? And so when it comes to, the low and slow, you can like do some of this with things like organ meats. So particularly for people, because you mentioned carnivore, Patricia, who are going in that direction, and perhaps in part because of nutrient density, or, because they're having so much problems with plants at the moment. The kinds of foods that you might be able to do that may be able to deliver enough bioavailable nutrients of the right kinds would be organ meats. And because I've worked with some people in places like Nigeria and Africa, and over COVID, when they could not get supplements, we did work with using things like organ meats. And I actually had one client who was taking a pre-measured amount of liver on one day and then a pre-measured amount of kidney on another day. And we were kind of rotating organ meats through this person's diet to try and help them get enough of the B6 and the B1 and, you know, support to their body in order to be able to handle the situation they were in. I did not know for sure whether or not this person was an endogenous producer or any kind of significant endogenous producer. My suspicion is that the more resilient your body is at the moment, the less likely you are an endogenous producer, and the more unwell or the more fragile you are, the more likely it is that you would not be able to handle a supplement, then the more likely you would be endogenous. So for those who haven't done an oat, you know, this can be kind of an indicator, not perfect though. So this particular client, I may have been somewhere on the endogenous producing level. I can't say that for sure, but because of the amount of health issues they had, I was a little bit suspicious. But what we did was just work straight ahead with nutrients, and we did it with organ meats. So that can be an approach that some people can do in order to try and get the nutrients they need without supplements. But honestly, having worked with somebody like this, I do think that supplements give you sort of a clearer indicator and easier control. And if you've been able to do something like an oat test, that's probably the best one to help you figure out whether you're an endogenous producer or not. May not be perfect, but it's probably the better one we have out there. But I'll turn the floor over to Karla and Patricia on this one.
We found out, you know, with my son strictly by accident, just because we had switched from one B complex to another. And that was the only thing that we had changed. So when he started dumping and the dumping was decidedly different from what we would typically see, you know, I had to go back and look and ask myself what's changed that we're getting this when we normally wouldn't, you know, we wouldn't see rashes like this. And logging what you're taking can help. That was what helped us, because I was able to go back and look and say, okay, we switched from this B complex to this B complex. What's different between those two? And we were able to pinpoint, yeah, it was, you know, it was the form of B1 that seemed to trigger the dumping. And at that point, I didn't know a whole lot about endogenous production. We had just started discussing that on the Yahoo group. So, you know, that was like, yeah, I think my kid might be, you know, might be an endogenous producer. Let me talk a little bit more with Susan and see. And from the testing, like I said, looking at the oat, she was like, yeah, you know, B1 is an issue, B6 is a bigger issue. But, you know, it was, you know, if we'd have stayed on the same B complex that we've been using for the past, you know, couple of years, wouldn't have known for a lot longer. So we, you know, it was kind of dumb luck in our case.
Yeah. I think another issue that we haven't touched yet is that some people have something that's called genetic hyperoxaluria. And that is a rare condition. So it's very possible that not many people have it in this group. But the fact that this is a low oxalate diet group, I would not be surprised that some people do have it and might be thinking that it's all coming from food, and it's actually a genetic condition. And in that case, if they get to test with the oat, it's a urine test, then you would see very, very high levels of oxalate coming out of the urine. And in those cases, it's a very serious condition. And usually the treatment is at the, after they've gone through many, many years of extremely high oxalate circulating through their body, is a kidney liver transplant. So it's not to scare anybody, but just to let you know what the three possibilities are. You can have exogenous oxalate coming from the outside, from your diet, from what you're eating. You can make endogenous oxalate because your metabolism is missing some key things that allow it to go through the regular route, let's just put it that way, and it makes it go through a tangent route, because the body is such an incredible machine that it always has like different possibilities of directing things and handling, the chemistry that's available. And then you have that third case, which is very, very rare, where actually out of your own a genetic defect, you start producing this oxalate constantly. And it's really interesting that once the transplant takes place, then it usually takes about 2 years for the excess oxalate to be cleared from the body. That's, what some of the research does. Now, I was in a conference in Germany with Susan and our doctor in Barcelona, and we were at the hyperoxaluria conference, and they were showing the case of a particular boy that had the genetic one. And I was very, very touched when I saw this video, because this little child was eating curry in the hospital. And I was just like, that cannot be helping. I'm just, I was really, I was sad for this little boy. It was probably delicious, but if he's already dealing with a high production of a toxin, why would you give it more? But so it's just a little bit, of understanding that whole process. I think oxalate has always been a part of human diet, but in very, very limited amounts, in very, very short and very specific periods of time. It's modern living that has made it available year round and in very large quantities at a very low cost. If you would grow your own spinach and your own rhubarb and your own whatever, you would have, maybe a couple of weeks, a year of the stuff. You would not be eating it day in, day out, in incredible amounts. You would not be having strawberries or blackberries in January in the northern hemispheres. So,
and you would not be eating almond flour for everything. So nut flours are a crazy source of oxalate for people.
One thing to note with the genetic hyperoxaluria, there are three variants of it at this point that have been identified. They are all at this point tested at birth. So if there is an upside, is that when your child is born, they do a whole hoop of genetic testing initially, not just for that, but for, metabolic conditions. So at least in the US, if your kid has genetic hyperoxaluria, chances are you're going to know about it very early on.
Yeah. We have a question. Should you take B6 and B1 with food or without?
Personally, I always take, most of my vitamin supplements with food. And that's for two reasons. One, there's something to remind me. So there's like this clear trigger. Oh yes, I'm going to take my next dose of X now. But also our digestive tract is used to getting multiple nutrients mixed in our food. So, you know, I'm not worried as much about whether or not the digestive tract can figure out how to get this nutrient out, because we are designed to be able to take you know, complex nutrition in. But the other thing is, I find that B vitamins on their own will make me feel nauseous. And so it's always better for me to take my B vitamins of any sort just on principle with food, because then I don't get that nausea. But something like a B complex on an empty stomach, oh, that's nasty.
I'm kind of the opposite. I take the B6 first thing in the morning. If I take it any later, I'll be up for, like my kid, for the rest of the night. And my breakfast is what do they call it? Bulletproof coffee. So I'm taking it with a little bit of fat, you know, a little bit of coconut oil, a little bit of butter, and that's pretty much it. And at least for me, the bees don't tend to aggravate my gut. I can't take a multivitamin on an empty stomach, or it comes right back up. But I'm good with bees.
I might have to try that anyway.
Yeah. Actually, another thing that I think is really interesting is how to start incorporating the bees. At least in the autism world, and I'm sure Karla is going to agree with me, there are a lot of kids that go ballistic on some of the bees. And some of the things that I have found useful is to always start with B1, with biotin. Always start with biotin and get your biotin established. And once the biotin is established, then you start with thiamine, and then thiamine is established and biotin is established, and then the pegs of that wheel are moving in the right order, so to speak. And then start with your B6, and all of them start with the fifth and start putting it up slowly and slowly. And with that, I found that most kids can tolerate them. I've had some of the kids of friends of mine that, you know, take a bolus dose of B6 and literally start chewing out bites of like sofas and things like that, because they're in pain. They're not happy campers. They're extremely agitated. So they have no filter or less filter, but what's happening to them, what they're resenting, it's probably also what's happening to us. So I think this whole idea of just respecting and listening to your body and doing everything slowly and in the right order, it's going to be a really good idea. And concerning B6, the other recommendation that Susan always does is that you should always take twice the milligrams of magnesium as you do of B6. Always. And it's just a good idea. It allows us to, well, I'd lie if I tell you that I could explain the whole interaction right now, but as something that you will do and you need to remember, and those things that you need to keep in mind when you're brain fogged and you're dumping and you're not feeling too good, is that your B6 always has to be accompanied.
Well, it's the same with biotin as well.
Mm-hmm.
Magnesium is a cofactor for so many of the B vitamins. So if you don't have enough magnesium on board, you know, a lot of the time a lot of times the B6 and other B vitamins aren't going to be as effective. One of the things that we found with my son was, instead of starting out with a complex, we had to do vitamins, especially the Bs, individually, because a lot of the B complexes have folic acid. Made my kid absolutely insane. But we had to break it down into the individual Bs to figure out, yep, it's the folic acid that's doing it. And so we had to switch to folinic initially, and then we did a mix of folinic and folate and methylfolate, and he's good with that. But it's always a good idea to start one at a time and log. My kid was 4. He couldn't really articulate, what was happening to him other than through, yep, this caused a meltdown. So, log your reactions and know that your reactions may not be instantaneous. It may take a couple of days because maybe it's the dose as opposed to the specific vitamin. Maybe he's just not processing it, initially, and he's good with this amount, but once it builds up to a certain amount, that's too much. So, give it a week or two to figure out, and like I said, log reactions. And a negative reaction is, still something you want to log.
So. Absolutely. Another thing is that in order to separate the supplement, a good idea is just to take them separately in time. So if you separate your thiamine from your B6, you separate your biotin from your B6, and just take it at different times a day so that you give each a really fair chance and you know what's happening. And also you avoid those interactions just with the time lapse. It's just a very simple way to facilitate the work of your body. But in the same, just contrasting to that, magnesium needs to accompany all of those, as a cofactor. I don't know if you have I don't know if we have other questions, because we went through. Is there anything known if a carnivore diet could reduce the amount of endogenous produced oxalate?
Nothing that I've seen, and I'm the one who normally moderates our TLO carnivores group, but nothing that I've seen that specifically says that a carnivore diet reduces the amount of endogenously produced oxalate. So this, I'd say is an open question at this point.
Yeah. And usually, I don't know, don't have any literature, but if we're talking that endogenous oxalate is something that is missing, that is keeping, the wheel to turn around and go in this particular direction, and it's going in this particular direction, then you want to fix the issue that is causing that alternative route. So it's a little bit like if you have a leak in a tube in your lavabo, and then of course you can condemn that lavabo and no water is going to go through, or you can put tape around the hole, and the water might have a little leak, but it might work. You can change the tube and it would get fixed in a different way. So what I'm trying to say is that there might be different ways of handling it, but in endogenous oxalate production, it's really a metabolic issue. So you really want to have those specific nutrients at the right time to open that vein and just letting everything turn around and go the way it should be.
Yeah, we've got a few questions now coming in. Unfortunately, we've only got about 10 minutes left, folks, but I've got someone here saying probably worth mentioning that certain foods like collagen can contribute to endogenous production. Thank you for the reminder. There are certain things where if you eat them in large amounts or concentrated doses, your body's more likely to, metabolize them into oxalate. Collagen's one of them. Glycine's another possibility. This is one of those places where it might be worthwhile, at least with the glycine issue, to have your genetics checked, because if you've got glycine SNPs, which may be causing some of the issue, that's worth checking out. And I apologize, my phone's going off in the background. Does somebody want to pick up here?
I don't know that I would eliminate all of these foods. I would probably just limit the amount. Bone broth isn't necessarily a bad thing. 5 to 6 cups of it a day, probably not so good. A quarter cup, half cup, maybe just fine. A little can go a long way.
Yeah, the problem's really in the dose, isn't it? Like if you get this huge dose or a big concentration of it all at once. So if somebody's using a little bit of bone broth as part of a soup stock, and it's not that you're just eating or drinking, consuming a cup or more of a bone broth all by itself all at once. I think the gut is handling that slightly differently. So we have it's not exactly the same, but it's one of the issues with vitamin C. Small amounts of vitamin C, your body's going to handle differently than huge concentrated doses where you don't have the capacity to recycle the vitamin C. And so that becomes part of your endogenous oxalate production, is this vitamin C degrading into oxalate. But in the case of that one, we have to be able to recycle the vitamin C. We need other antioxidants in the system. And we're back to this, water wheel analogy, where it's overloading with one nutrient's not really working for us, because we have to have all the capacities at all the steps around the entire wheel. And to some degree, that's also the issue with collagen, is that we want collagen in our bodies. It's certainly fine in context of a whole food. Like there's collagen when you eat your meat in a meal, for instance, but that's not a big concentrated serving of it all at once either. You're going to digest that out from all the other constituents in the meat. And if that's diffusing then into your system more slowly, so your system can use it all at once, I think there's indication that that's less likely to be shunted into these pathways where you might end up with oxalate.
Yeah.
And actually somebody said, do we have to avoid foods like bacon or meats like chuck roast, which have more connective tissue? I'm not sure that's necessary. I mean, as long as that's not 100% of your diet, I guess. But meats that have more connective tissue in them, think about eating them in the context of the entire animal. If you were eating, from nose to tail, so to speak, all of your diet wouldn't be all collagen. It wouldn't be all liver. It wouldn't be all many things. You can actually have a problem if you eat too much liver, because you can develop vitamin A toxicity because it's just too rich in it. So think about it in context of the animal overall, and eating it in the context of whole foods, not focusing just exclusively on, I'm going to get lots of extra collagen because that's going to be somehow extra beneficial to me. You know, sometimes the problem's in the dose.
There's another question. Maybe it will turn out that for some people, a carnivore diet is a B1 sparing or B6 sparing diet, and that might be how it lowers endogenous production. I have no idea, Kelly, to tell you the truth. I don't know.
Yeah, great question. This is, you know, there's lots of room for research to be done.
Yes, she says, my understanding is higher carb intake requires more B1 to process. So seems like a chance this could play in a factor with regarding carnivore. It could. I don't have any experience with that. I really can't tell. But it was a really good session. I just have this one last, I have two last announcements that I want to make. One of them is, well, the first thing is, I guess it was a comment that we didn't talk about it. We talked about the exogenous oxalate, the endogenous oxalate via the metabolism. And then we talked about the genetic hyperoxaluria. There's another producer of oxalate, which could be some microorganisms. And we didn't get to talk about that, but there's some of them, like some of the mold that sometimes grows in fridges or in the, the moldy corners in in a moist house and things like that. Which is called an aspergillus, and that particular bug, if you want to think of it that way, that one produces oxalate. But a lot of the other ones that have been deemed guilty with the production of oxalate has not been, the case, at least as far as the science right now is. So there is some production of oxalate from infections by some of these aspergillus spores and things, but not from things like candida. And I guess we can have like a whole other discussion, but I just wanted to make sure that we touched like the 4 points that we were thinking for this segment. The other thing that I was going to tell you, and this is an announcement, is that we are going to be having, probably by the end of this week, a meeting with all the moderators. And we are super, super grateful to all of you for all of the comments that you've given us of what works with this group, what doesn't work, what can be improved, how you feel about it. And we've taken note of every single one of those comments, and we will be discussing them with proposals for solutions and best practices from other groups. And hopefully very, very soon, you're going to see a revamped Triangle Oxalates page with some of these bells and whistles that we have been learning as moderators. So just thank you for your patience, and we asked for a little bit more, and hopefully you're going to start seeing some things that you will find useful and easy to handle, to be able to take the most advantage of this very healing diet. So I guess that's it for me. Thank you so much for joining us on this Monday, and we will see you next week. And I'll leave it to you two ladies.
Happy holiday Monday to any fellow Canadians who are watching this. Lovely to be here with you today, and hope this has been helpful.
Okay, then we'll see you next Monday. And just remember, low and slow is the way to go. Take care.